In the quiet suburbs, my life appeared flawless, a picture-perfect existence that anyone looking in could only envy. Our home was large, spacious, with a backyard that stretched far beyond what anyone would need, but still felt like a private sanctuary. The pool sparkled in the sunlight, its water shimmering like a flawless mirror, reflecting the promises of leisure and contentment. My husband, David, was a hard-working man, always dressed in his office attire, making his way through a world of deadlines and responsibilities. We had a son, Jake, who was on the cusp of graduating college, a young man full of potential and dreams. To anyone else, it seemed like we had everything: success, wealth, a beautiful family. But beneath the surface, there was a different story, one that no one saw. I had long stopped feeling the warmth of our marriage. The connection that once filled the air between David and me had dissipated over the years, replaced by an unspoken distance, a coldness that crept in when we weren't looking. David, consumed by the demands of his career, would come home late and retreat into his world of emails, phone calls, and late-night meetings. When he wasn't working, he sat in front of the television, lost in shows that I knew neither of us cared about. I couldn't even remember the last time we had shared a real conversation, the kind that lingered beyond the everyday logistics of life. The love that had once seemed to bind us together had become a distant memory, something I could only recall in fleeting moments. I tried to fill the emptiness. I threw myself into caring for our home, making sure everything was perfect, that the house remained a welcoming space for David, even if he rarely noticed the effort. I focused on Jake, making sure his college years were full of opportunity, even though he, too, was becoming distant, caught up in his own world of school, friends, and newfound independence. The silence in our home was louder than any conversation we could have had. I began to feel invisible, as if my existence was nothing more than a backdrop to the lives of the others around me. Then, one summer afternoon, everything began to shift. It started with a simple glance, one that lasted a bit longer than necessary, but it was enough. Marcus was Jake's best friend, a young man I had seen countless times but never really paid much attention to. He was polite, always courteous, and never seemed to make a fuss. I had always seen him as just another of Jake's friends, someone who came over to hang out, to swim in our pool or play video games with Jake. But that afternoon, when the sunlight hit the water just right and I caught a glimpse of him, something inside me stirred. There he was, standing at the edge of the pool, his body gleaming in the sun, water droplets cascading down his toned form. His presence was magnetic, drawing my eyes to him even as I tried to look away. It wasn't just his physical appearance, though that was undeniable. It was his confidence, the way he stood tall and unbothered by the world around him. His effortless grace contrasted sharply with the tired, disinterested man I had been living with for so long. He didn't seem weighed down by the daily grind of life. He exuded life, energy, something that I had forgotten existed. I quickly pushed the thought away, blaming it on the summer heat, or perhaps the solitude of the afternoon. But as the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His presence, once a fleeting part of my life, began to take on a new significance. It wasn't just when he was physically there. It was in the way he made me feel when he wasn't. He became a quiet, constant presence in the back of my mind, an energy I couldn't seem to shake. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I was a married woman, a mother. I had responsibilities. I couldn't afford to feel this way. But every time he walked into a room, every time he laughed with Jake or casually leaned against the counter to talk to me, I found myself drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't like me to feel this way. Not at this stage of my life. I had spent so many years focused on everyone else, on keeping up appearances, on making sure everything looked perfect on the outside. But the truth was, I hadn't felt truly alive in years. I had become a caretaker, a mother, a wife, but not a woman, not someone who could feel the rush of excitement, the spark of something new. As I tried to ignore these feelings, I realized that I wasn't just longing for the attention that Marcus gave me, I was longing for something deeper, something I hadn't even known I had been missing. I wanted to feel noticed, to feel seen. I wanted to feel desired, not just in the way a wife should feel desired by her husband, but as a person, as an individual. The moments when Marcus was around made me feel alive again, but at the same time, they made me feel like I was betraying the life I had built. It was a dangerous game, and I knew it, yet I couldn't stop myself from playing it. In the quiet of my mind, I wrestled with the guilt, the shame of these feelings, but I also wrestled with something else, a deep desire to feel something beyond the numbness that had overtaken me for so long. For the first time in years, I found myself questioning everything: my marriage, my choices, my identity. And in that moment, I realized that what I was really searching for wasn't just someone to notice me, but a way to reclaim the part of myself that I had lost along the way. I wasn't just yearning for Marcus, I was yearning for me. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to spend more time in our home, each visit layering more complexity into the web of emotions that I could no longer deny. At first, I told myself that I was simply being overly sensitive, that it was nothing more than harmless attention from a young man seeking comfort in his best friend's house. After all, Jake and Marcus had been inseparable since childhood. They played together, studied together, and even worked out in our garage, where they would sweat through grueling sessions, pushing each other to be better. It was easy to convince myself that there was no harm in this. I was simply being a mother, being kind to a young man who had become like a second son to me. But each time Marcus entered a room, each time he smiled or looked at me with that quiet confidence, something inside me stirred. It was something I hadn't felt in years, something that both thrilled and terrified me. I had always been the one in the background, the one who made sure everyone else's needs were met. I kept the house running, prepared meals, drove Jake to and from school events, and listened to David's work troubles late at night. I prided myself on being the glue that held everything together. But somewhere in the midst of all of this, I had lost myself. I had become invisible, not just to the outside world, but to the man I had promised to love and cherish forever. David no longer saw me in the way he once had. The intimacy we shared had faded into polite exchanges and passing moments, his attention constantly absorbed by the demands of his job and the distractions of everyday life. I began to wonder if I had simply become a fixture in his world, a role to fill, rather than a person to love. Then came Marcus, with his energy, his vitality, and that effortless way he carried himself. He wasn't just physically attractive, it was his demeanor that intrigued me. There was a lightness to him, an ease in his presence that was so starkly different from the man I had been living with for years. Marcus didn't carry the weight of responsibility in the way that David did. He seemed carefree, confident in his own skin. And though I tried to dismiss it as a fleeting fascination, a passing distraction, I couldn't ignore the way my body responded when he was around, the way my heart skipped when he spoke to me, or the way my mind would wander to him long after he had left. I knew I shouldn't feel this way. I was a mother, a wife, a woman who had lived a life bound by commitment and responsibility. But Marcus made me feel something that I had long since forgotten. He made me feel alive. When he would sit on the edge of the pool, his lean, toned body glistening in the sun, I felt the ache in my chest that I hadn't realized was there. When our hands brushed as we exchanged polite pleasantries, I felt an electric charge race through me, a reminder that I was still capable of feeling desire, of feeling wanted. It terrified me because I knew what it meant. It meant that I had lost something essential, something important, that had once made me whole. The worst part was how much I began to look forward to his visits, how his presence became a kind of lifeline. It was as if, in the chaos of my life, he was the only thing that truly made me feel seen. He wasn't just another person in my life. He was a mirror to what I had become, someone yearning for connection, for the kind of attention that was no longer coming from the man I had married. And every time Marcus would smile, every time his eyes would linger just a little too long, I felt a stirring deep within me, a pull that I didn't know how to ignore. It wasn't just his attraction that affected me, it was the way he made me question everything. The way he made me realize that I had become a woman who had forgotten how to be seen, how to be desired, and how to love herself. In the quiet moments, when the house was empty and the only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves outside, I would allow myself to think about it. I thought about how it felt to be in his presence, how everything else seemed to fall away when I looked into his eyes. I wondered if this was more than just an innocent crush, more than a fleeting desire, but I didn't want to confront that thought. I told myself it was just a passing phase, that I could go back to being the woman I was before, the woman who cared for everyone else but herself. Yet, every time I saw Marcus, it became harder to believe that was even possible. It wasn't just the fleeting moments of attraction that got to me, though. It was the way he seemed to understand me in a way no one else did. There was a quiet depth to him, a knowing, like he could see beneath the surface. I began to feel like I was floating, like I was no longer tethered to the life I had built. And with every stolen glance, every word we shared, I found myself slipping deeper into something I couldn't explain, something I wasn't ready to face. But the more I tried to fight it, the more it seemed to consume me. The hardest part was the guilt that gnawed at me, the constant battle between what was right and what I longed for. I knew that the choices I was making were dangerous. I knew the consequences would be severe. But even in that knowledge, I couldn't stop myself from being drawn to him. I didn't want to betray my family, my marriage. But somewhere deep inside, I questioned if that was even enough anymore. Was my loyalty to a relationship that no longer made me feel alive enough to keep me from exploring the feelings that Marcus had awakened in me? Could I ignore the fact that, for the first time in years, I felt desired, seen, and alive? And as the days passed, I realized something far more unsettling than the attraction I felt toward Marcus. I realized that I had been living in a fog, disconnected from myself, from my desires, from who I used to be. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew that Marcus wasn't the problem. He was simply a reflection of something I had ignored for too long. The woman I had forgotten, the person I had once been, the woman who had dreams, desires, and the right to feel valued. The real question I had to face wasn't about Marcus at all. It was about me and whether or not I could find a way back to the person I had lost. As the days wore on, the weight of my feelings for Marcus grew heavier, pressing down on me with an intensity I couldn't escape. At first, I tried to push it all aside, to tell myself that it was just a passing infatuation, something harmless that would fade in time. But it didn't fade. If anything, it deepened, and with each passing day, I found myself more consumed by thoughts of him. I couldn't deny the undeniable pull I felt whenever he was near. His presence had become a constant ache inside me, a yearning for something I didn't fully understand, but knew I desperately needed. It wasn't just the physical attraction that kept drawing me to him, though that part was undeniable. There was something far deeper at play, an emotional connection that I couldn't quite grasp, but that seemed to wrap itself around my heart, tightening with every stolen glance, every whispered conversation. It wasn't that Marcus did anything extraordinary. In fact, much of what he did was simple: a smile, a look, a casual touch. Yet each gesture seemed to peel back the layers of my carefully constructed life, revealing a woman I had long buried beneath the roles of wife, mother, and caretaker. With Marcus, I felt seen. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. He made me feel like I was more than just the woman in the background, more than just the mother who took care of everything without question. With him, I wasn't invisible. With him, I was someone worth paying attention to. But that was the problem, wasn't it? It was too easy to get lost in the way Marcus made me feel. His attentiveness, his warmth, the way he seemed to understand something about me that no one else did. It was intoxicating. Every time our paths crossed, every time he lingered just a little longer than necessary, I could feel myself slipping deeper into something I couldn't control. I began to crave those moments, to anticipate the next time I would see him, the next time I would feel his presence in the room, his eyes on me. But with that craving came guilt, a sharp, biting reminder of who I was: a wife, a mother, a woman with responsibilities, a woman who had promised herself and her family that she would be faithful, true. And yet, here I was, standing on the precipice of something I couldn't walk away from, something I didn't know how to stop. I had spent so many years buried in the responsibilities of family life, so many years living for others, that I had forgotten what it was like to live for myself. I had forgotten what it was like to feel desired, to feel wanted. I had forgotten that I was more than just a caretaker. With Marcus, I remembered. I remembered what it was like to feel alive, to feel the rush of excitement, of passion, of being seen for who I truly was. And as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't turn away from that feeling. It was in these moments of reflection, in the quiet times when I was alone with my thoughts, that I realized how deeply I had lost myself over the years, how much of me had been swallowed by the roles I had taken on, by the expectations of being a wife and mother, by the need to keep everything together, even when my own world was falling apart. The worst part was that I had allowed myself to become invisible. To David, to Jake, to the world, I had become a shadow, a caretaker without a voice, without a presence of my own. But Marcus, with his youthful energy and unspoken understanding, made me feel like I could be more than that. He made me feel like I was still capable of something beyond the routine, beyond the predictable life I had come to accept. And that was the danger, wasn't it? I had started to confuse his attention, his interest, with something deeper. It wasn't that Marcus was the answer to my problems, that he could fill the emptiness I felt inside. It was that he represented something I had long since lost: a sense of self, a sense of being seen and valued as an individual, not just as someone's wife or mother. He was the reflection of the woman I had forgotten, the woman I had neglected in the process of being everything else. And the more I allowed myself to indulge in those feelings, the more I found myself questioning everything I had built. I started to wonder what my life would look like if I let go of the guilt, if I stopped fighting the pull I felt toward Marcus. What would it be like to stop pretending, to stop being the dutiful wife, the invisible woman in the background? What would it feel like to take control of my own life, to stop living for everyone else and start living for me? I knew the consequences of my actions would be severe. I knew the damage I was potentially causing, not just to my marriage, but to my family, to the life I had built with David. And yet, I couldn't help but feel a longing to break free from the chains I had unknowingly wrapped around myself. The guilt was unbearable. Every time Marcus would smile at me, every time our hands brushed or our eyes met in that way that made my heart race, I could feel the weight of the choices I had made. I knew I was betraying David, betraying everything we had built together. I knew that I was risking everything for a fleeting moment of excitement, of desire. But as much as I tried to fight it, to push those feelings aside, I knew deep down that I was no longer just fighting for my marriage. I was fighting for myself, for the woman I had forgotten, the woman who deserved to be seen, to be desired, to be alive. In the end, it wasn't about Marcus. It was about me, about my own need for validation, for connection, for something beyond the life I had built for everyone else. And as much as I hated myself for it, I knew I had to face that truth. I had to acknowledge the parts of me that I had buried, the parts that Marcus had unknowingly brought to the surface. The question wasn't about whether or not I could resist Marcus. It was whether or not I could resist the deeper longing that had awakened inside me, a longing that had been dormant for far too long. The weight of my choices, the guilt that had been simmering inside me for weeks, finally reached its breaking point. What had begun as an innocent crush, a fleeting moment of desire that I thought I could control, had slowly morphed into something much deeper, much more dangerous. I had tried to dismiss it, to convince myself that it was just a passing fancy, that it would eventually fade. But the truth was undeniable. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. It started small, the stolen glances, the casual touches, the unspoken tension that seemed to grow between Marcus and me every time we were alone. But as time passed, those moments became harder to ignore. The way he looked at me, with such intensity, such understanding, was like nothing I had experienced in years. It was as if he could see through the layers I had built around myself, the walls I had carefully constructed to protect my heart from the emptiness I felt inside. And when he smiled, that knowing, quiet smile, I couldn't help but feel something shift within me. I was no longer just a wife, a mother, a caretaker. In those moments, I was someone who mattered, someone who could still be desired. But the more I indulged in these feelings, the more I found myself drowning in guilt. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew I was betraying David, the man I had promised to love and honor, the father of my child. I could feel the weight of my actions, the invisible thread that was slowly unraveling the fabric of my family. And yet, every time I saw Marcus, every time our eyes met, I felt an overwhelming pull that I couldn't resist. I was caught between two worlds, the life I had built, full of responsibility and expectation, and a desire for something more, something that made me feel alive again. The guilt gnawed at me every day. It wasn't just about my actions, it was about what those actions meant for the people I loved. David, my husband, who had become a stranger to me over the years. How would he feel if he knew? How would Jake, our son, feel if he found out his mother had betrayed the trust of his best friend? The consequences of my choices seemed too great to ignore, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. The truth was, I had spent so many years being everything for everyone else that I had forgotten how to be something for myself. I had forgotten how to live for me, how to feel what it was like to be seen and desired, not just as a wife or mother, but as a woman. And that was where the true conflict lay. I wasn't just struggling with the guilt of betrayal. I was struggling with my own identity, with the realization that I had lost myself in the process of trying to be everything for everyone else. I had buried my own needs and desires beneath the weight of family obligations and responsibilities. I had become invisible in my own life, and Marcus had unknowingly brought me back to the surface, made me remember what it felt like to be alive, to feel wanted. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The day it all came crashing down was inevitable. It was a quiet evening, one of those rare moments when the house felt still, when the noise of everyday life had temporarily faded. David had gone out for a business dinner, and Jake was upstairs, busy with his own world. The house was empty, save for Marcus and me. I had tried to ignore the feelings that swirled inside me, tried to pretend that everything was normal, that I could continue to live this lie. But the truth was there, hanging in the air between us, thick and palpable. It was in the kitchen, of all places, where everything finally unraveled. Marcus came in for a glass of water, as he often did, and for a moment I convinced myself that it was nothing, just another ordinary moment, but it wasn't ordinary. The tension between us was undeniable. When he spoke my name, the way it sounded on his lips, it sent a shiver down my spine. And then, in that moment of weakness, it happened. Our hands brushed, a fleeting touch, but enough to set off a chain reaction. The world around us seemed to disappear. I was no longer just a wife, no longer just a mother. I was a woman who was desired, who was seen, who was wanted. And for a brief moment, it felt like everything I had been missing, everything I had been longing for, was within reach. But that brief moment of freedom came at a cost. The guilt, the shame, the fear of what I had just done, it all came rushing back. I could hear the voices in my head, reminding me of the consequences of my actions. This was wrong. It was all wrong. And yet, even in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to stop. I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. It was like a drug, a craving I couldn't resist, and I had already taken the first hit. The reality of what I had done hit me the moment I saw David's face. He had come home earlier than expected, and I could see the confusion, the hurt in his eyes. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. And that was the worst part, because I knew that once the truth came out, once he knew what I had done, there would be no going back. The damage would be done. The trust we had built, the life we had shared, would be shattered beyond repair. In the days that followed, everything fell apart. I tried to explain to justify my actions, but the truth was, there was no excuse for what I had done. There was no way to undo the hurt I had caused. The guilt weighed on me like a heavy cloak, suffocating me with every breath I took. And as much as I wanted to run from it, to pretend that nothing had changed, I couldn't. I had broken something that could never be fixed. I had betrayed my family, my husband, my son, and most of all, myself. The consequences of my actions were impossible to ignore, and as much as I tried to move forward, I knew that I would never be the same again. The guilt would linger, a constant reminder of the price I had paid for a moment of weakness, a moment of desire that had cost me everything I had ever known. And in the end, I realized that sometimes the damage we do to others is nothing compared to the damage we do to ourselves. The aftermath of my choices was far more brutal than I had ever imagined. The cracks that had formed in my marriage and my family were no longer subtle or easily ignored. They were deep and jagged, cutting through the very foundation of everything I thought I knew. In the days that followed, I found myself grappling with the unbearable weight of guilt and regret, but it wasn't just the emotional devastation that I had to face. It was the consequences, the lives I had disrupted, the trust I had shattered, and the relationships I had irreparably damaged. David, who had been so distant and disengaged for years, had been blindsided by the truth. I had expected anger, but I hadn't expected the hollow look in his eyes, the way he seemed to shrink in front of me. The man I had shared a life with, the father of my child, was no longer just disappointed. He was broken, and it was in that moment, when I saw the pain I had caused him reflected so starkly in his face, that I realized how much I had lost. My actions weren't just a betrayal of our marriage, but a betrayal of the man who had stood by my side for so long, the man who, despite everything, still cared for me. I had destroyed that care, shattered it with my selfishness, and now I had to live with the consequences. Jake, our son, was no less affected. He had always seen Marcus as a close friend, someone he trusted, and suddenly that friendship was tainted by the affair that had unfolded in our home. When the truth came out, the anger he felt was unimaginable. It wasn't just the betrayal of his best friend, it was the betrayal of his mother. I had hurt him in ways I never intended, and in doing so, I had severed the one relationship that mattered most to me. The guilt of knowing I had caused that pain, that I had torn apart his sense of security and trust, was a weight I could barely bear. Every time I saw his face, the look of disbelief and hurt in his eyes, I felt the sting of my own selfishness, a reminder that the damage I had done wasn't just to me, but to the people I loved most in this world. The shame I felt in those first few days after everything had come out was suffocating. I tried to apologize, tried to explain that I never meant for any of this to happen, but words felt inadequate. There was no excuse for what I had done. No amount of remorse could undo the harm I had caused. My actions were unforgivable, and I knew it. But even in my deepest despair, I couldn't help but wonder if the damage was permanent. Could trust ever be rebuilt? Could I ever repair the rift I had caused in my marriage, in my relationship with my son? Or had I destroyed everything irrevocably? In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece together the shattered fragments of my life, but nothing felt the same. The home that had once been a place of comfort now felt cold and foreign. David moved into the guest room, and the silence between us was deafening. The small exchanges we had, the polite conversations we forced ourselves to have, only emphasized the chasm that had opened up between us. There were no more moments of connection, no more shared experiences. The intimacy we had once had was gone, replaced by an awkward tension that hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. The worst part was that, despite all of this, I wasn't sure if we could ever go back. I wasn't sure if the man I had married could ever look at me the same way again, if he could ever trust me the way he once had. And even more devastating, I wasn't sure if I deserved that trust. As for Marcus, he had disappeared from our lives entirely. His friendship with Jake was over, a casualty of the affair. I couldn't blame him for it. The guilt I felt for bringing him into this mess, for allowing him to become a part of something so destructive, was another burden I had to carry. He had been a symbol of everything I had longed for, a fleeting moment of excitement and desire in the midst of a life that had become stale and monotonous. But that moment had come at too high a price. I had lost everything that mattered for something I couldn't even fully comprehend. And in the end, Marcus had walked away, not just from me, but from the entire mess I had created. I could hardly blame him for choosing to leave, for choosing to move on from the chaos I had dragged him into. Months later, I still found myself living in the ruins of my choices, picking up the pieces of a life that would never be the same. David and I had started therapy, but it was clear that the road to recovery, if it was even possible, would be long and painful. The trust that had once bound us together had been torn apart, and it seemed unlikely that it could ever be fully repaired. We were strangers, bound together by a history of shared experiences, but no longer united by the love that had once defined us. I was no longer the woman I had been before, the woman who had trusted and loved without question. I was a woman marked by guilt, regret, and the realization that the choices we make, even the smallest ones, can have lasting consequences that echo through every part of our lives. And yet, amidst the pain, there was a small glimmer of hope, the realization that even in the darkest moments, we have the power to choose. I had chosen to make a mistake, to betray the trust of the people I loved most, but that didn't mean I was forever defined by that mistake. I could still try to rebuild, to learn from my actions, and to become a better person, even if it meant facing the consequences of my choices every single day. The damage had been done, but perhaps there was still a way forward. Perhaps through time and effort, I could find a way to heal the wounds I had caused, both in myself and in the people I loved. But one thing was certain: I would never forget the lesson I had learned. That one moment of weakness can destroy everything, but it can also be the catalyst for change. In the end, this story is not just about one woman's mistakes or the consequences of betrayal. It is a reflection on the complexity of human emotions, the fragility of trust, and the importance of being true to ourselves. Life is full of choices, big and small, and sometimes the smallest moment of weakness can alter the course of everything we hold dear. We all make mistakes, and often we find ourselves caught in the whirlwind of emotions that cloud our judgment. But the true power lies not in the mistakes we make, but in how we choose to learn from them, how we grow and evolve from our errors. The most painful realization for Amanda was not the moment she fell into temptation, but the fact that she had lost herself along the way. In her quest to please others, to be the perfect wife, mother, and caretaker, she had forgotten the importance of taking care of herself. She had allowed the demands of life to erase her sense of individuality, to make her feel invisible. The moment she connected with Marcus, she rediscovered a part of herself that had long been buried beneath the weight of responsibility. But that rediscovery came at a high cost. This story teaches us that we must never lose sight of who we are in the process of being everything to everyone else. We need to remember that self-care, self-love, and self-worth are not selfish acts, but necessary ones. It is easy to get lost in the roles we play in life, but if we forget our own needs, our own desires, and our own sense of self, we risk losing the very foundation of who we are. We must understand that it is not just about fulfilling the expectations of others, but about fulfilling our own needs for connection, for love, and for personal growth. Furthermore, the story highlights the importance of trust in relationships. Trust is the bedrock of any relationship, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, or a bond with family. Once broken, trust is incredibly difficult to rebuild. The damage done by betrayal is not easily repaired, and often the effects linger far longer than we anticipate. But while trust can be broken, it is not always beyond repair. If we are willing to do the work, to confront our mistakes, and to seek forgiveness, there is always hope. Healing may take time, and rebuilding may seem impossible, but it is through these painful experiences that we often find the strength to become better versions of ourselves. The emotional depth of this story serves as a reminder that we are all human, and we are all capable of making mistakes. However, we are also capable of change, growth, and redemption. It is never too late to take responsibility for our actions, to learn from them, and to make amends where possible. No matter how far we have fallen, there is always a way back, a path forward that leads to healing and self-discovery. So, let this story serve as a call to action, a reminder that our choices matter, that the way we treat ourselves and others has lasting consequences, and that through introspection and personal growth, we can find the strength to rebuild and move forward. Life may not always go according to plan, and we will face moments of weakness, but it is in those moments that we have the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to emerge stronger. If you found this story insightful and resonating, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support means the world and will motivate us to continue bringing you more captivating, emotional, and thought-provoking content. Stay tuned for more stories that touch the deepest corners of the human heart and remind us of the beauty of redemption and personal growth. Subscribe now and be a part of this incredible journey.